No crime, no resistance. Yet 2 cops still swarmed a black female soldier like she was trash on the sidewalk, groping her, restraining her, treating her body like they owned it. They thought she was weak, another silent victim, another name that would never trend. But this time, they picked the wrong one. A trained warrior, a storm in uniform, a woman who could bring down an entire rotten police empire with just her name. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. She stood, and the whole damn system trembled. So now the question is, when justice is violated, who gets punished? The one who stayed silent, or the one who thought they'd never be caught? The scorching noon sun cast sharp shadows over the nearly deserted gas station, turning the cracked concrete into a simmering battlefield. A black female soldier stepped out of her SUV, the U.S. Army uniform hugging her powerful frame, each movement calculated and calm. Her boots thudded lightly on the ground as she moved to the gas pump, her gaze steady, unwavering, as if she were already aware of the storm gathering nearby. 2 police officers leaned against their cruiser, eyes slicing through the space between them and her. Officer 2's stare carried a twitching edge, hungry to provoke. Officer 2, hand hovering dangerously close to his holstered weapon, watched with a sharp, hateful gleam, his posture rigid and ready to strike at the smallest excuse. There was no kindness in their eyes, only a simmering contempt, itching to break free. She finished pumping gas and adjusted her uniform with a slow precision that radiated authority, her movements a silent declaration that she did not fear them. Officer 1 broke from his post, striding toward her with heavy, purposeful steps, his voice stabbed into the air, cold and abrupt. "Open the car, now." No explanation, no courtesy, only raw command spat out like a threat. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his face, the calm in her expression somehow more threatening than any raised voice. The sun glinted off the insignia on her chest, a silent badge of battles fought beyond their comprehension. "Officer." Haley looked at him, her thumb tapping the gun grip, sweat glistening along his temple. He watched her every breath, every twitch, looking for a reason to act. She held her ground, breathing slow and even, her hands at her sides, but her energy coiled tight like a loaded spring. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone controlled and low, slicing through the tension with surgical precision. Her question wasn't just a defense, it was a confrontation, a refusal to surrender her dignity. Officer White's lips curled into a snarl. His words spat like poison. "You think that black face of yours is clean enough to stand in court?" The words hung in the thick, burning air, each syllable a bullet meant to wound and belittle. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her eyes met his, a solid wall of unbreakable spirit. She seemed to absorb the insult, swallow it, and stand even taller because of it. The world seemed to contract around them, the hot air pressing in, thick with unsaid threat. Officer 2 moved closer, an ugly smirk stretching across his face as he leaned in, his breath sour and heavy. He hovered near her, the weapon at his hip a dark promise. She felt it, but didn't flinch. Instead, she repeated, her voice now edged with iron, "I have the right to make a call." The words cut through the space like a blade. Officer 2 snorted, his laughter jagged and sharp. "Who you gonna call? Your daddy? Maybe you want to tell your mama not to worry?" He sneered, each word dripping with cruel delight. His laugh echoed in the dead air, a sound more violent than a slap. She stayed rooted, her uniform seeming to cling to her with newfound intensity, the colors sharper, the insignia brighter. Every beat of her heart seemed to vibrate through the air, a silent, defiant drum. The officers circled, eyes hungry, yet each step closer only magnified her quiet power. She was a fortress in plain sight, her calm an act of silent aggression that unsettled them more than any threat could. Officer 1's fingers itched as he eyed the car door, craving a reaction, craving the chance to assert dominance. Officer 2's smirk faltered for a heartbeat, a crack in his armor when he saw no fear in her eyes. Heat rose in waves from the concrete, mirroring the rising fury and tension. Every detail, The tremor in Officer One's jaw, the way Officer Two flexed his fingers, her unwavering gaze, wove together into a moment taut enough to snap at any second. It wasn't just a standoff, it was a clash of worlds, a raw testament to her resilience against their festering hatred. In this searing silence, she claimed the ground beneath her feet, each breath a silent vow. They would not own her story. They would not define her worth. And though they sneered and spat venom, each word only strengthened the fortress inside her, a living monument to every battle she had already won before this one even began. The suffocating heat thickened around them, a silent witness to the ugly show unfolding. Officer One's eyes glimmered with a twisted thrill as he snatched her ID from her hand without a word, fingers brushing hers in an intentional invasion, a silent insult masked as procedure. He flipped the ID back and forth, his smirk curling deeper with each passing second, his voice a serrated blade as he repeated, "Where are you stationed? Who do you think you're protecting wearing this?" His tone dripped with venom, each syllable meant to degrade, to reduce her existence to something insignificant. Officer Two circled her like a shark scenting blood, his body pressing closer until the air between them felt poisoned. He shoved against her shoulder, a forceful nudge disguised as crowding, his breath hot and foul against her ear. "Stand still," he hissed, fingers itching for a confrontation, for a chance to unleash violence under the guise of duty. She stood firm, her muscles coiled beneath her uniform, her eyes locked forward, unflinching, an immovable pillar in the face of their cheap theatrics. Officer One let out a low laugh, sharp and echoing, slicing through the heavy quiet as he waved her ID in her face. "You think that uniform makes you special? You think you're better than us, standing there like some decorated saint?" His words spat like acid, meant to burn holes in her armor. Officer Two's gaze dropped to her chest, scanning her name, her rank, his lips curling into a sneer so cold it could have frozen the midday sun. "Just a soldier," he barked with mocking amusement, his laugh short and cruel. "Nothing special at all. Just another pawn playing hero." Each insult landed like a slap, but she remained composed, her chin lifted slightly higher, as if each verbal blow only polished the steel in her spine. Her silence was not submission, it was a calculated calm that screamed defiance louder than any shouted threat. She inhaled once, deeply, grounding herself in the sharp scent of gasoline and asphalt, her heartbeat steady, her soul unyielding. When she finally spoke, her voice was a cold blade slicing through their pathetic display. "I am a soldier," she declared, each word enunciated with deliberate force, her eyes drilling into theirs. "And I have the right to make a call." Her declaration crackled in the thick air, a thunderclap that momentarily stunned even the two officers. The authority in her voice wasn't borrowed from her uniform. It radiated from somewhere deeper, a place they could neither reach nor tarnish. "Officer?" One's laugh faltered, his grip on her ID tightening as though he could choke her spirit by crushing a piece of plastic. Officer Two shifted back half a step, momentarily thrown by the unwavering certainty blazing in her eye. But quickly his mask of mockery slid back into place, a desperate attempt to reclaim power slipping through his fingers. She held their gaze without flinching, a silent war raging in every breath, every beat of her heart. The heat pressed down on them all, but she alone seemed to grow stronger beneath it, as though the sun itself fed her resolve. Officer One spat to the side, his face twisted in a grotesque smirk, his eyes sharp and calculating as he leaned closer, whispering with poisonous sweetness, "That call won't save you." Officer Two's laugh followed, brittle and hollow, bouncing off the gas station walls like a cruel echo. Yet she did not move, did not shrink. Instead, she stood taller, each inch of her presence daring them to break themselves against her defiance. The space between them trembled with electricity, the world holding its breath as two predators realized their prey was not a victim, but a force beyond their comprehension. And in that charged silence, her steady breath was a promise. She would not bend. She would not yield. and their contempt would only fuel her unstoppable fire. Her unwavering stare ignited an invisible fire in the stifling air, as Officer One's interrogation turned relentless, his words slicing like shards of glass. He peppered her with meaningless questions, each one more invasive and demeaning than the last, his tone dripping with that same vicious delight, trying to grind her spirit into the dust beneath their boots. Yet she stood immovable, her voice slicing through his noise like a sword drawn in moonlight. "I have the right to make one call," she repeated, her words heavy with an unbreakable authority that crackled in the thickening silence. "Officer?" Two let out a snide laugh, sharp enough to draw blood. "Who you gonna call? Your daddy?" He jeered, eyes gleaming with cruel excitement. "Maybe tell Mommy you're late for dinner," he added, his voice rising in a shrill, mocking melody, bouncing off the walls like a grotesque echo. A flicker of irritation darted across Officer One's face, but he threw his hand up in false surrender, a sarcastic tilt of his head. "Fine. One call. Make it quick," he spat, each word spat out like rotten seeds. Her hand moved slowly to her pocket, each movement deliberate, her fingers brushing the cool surface of her phone with a quiet confidence that filled the space between them with electric tension. As she lifted the device, it felt like she was drawing a weapon more dangerous than any firearm. The moment stretched, taut and trembling, as her thumb hovered above the screen. The officers watched, eyes narrowing, unable to read her next move. The world seemed to shrink to the steady beat of her breath, the rhythmic pulse of her heart echoing in her skull. She dialed the number with a precision that spoke of countless drills, each digit pressed like a note in a battle hymn. Bringing the phone to her ear, her voice rang out, low and unwavering, each word slicing the air with surgical accuracy. "I'd like to make one phone call." The sentence dropped like a bomb between them. Officer One shifted, his smirk faltering, his fingers flexing as if itching to snatch the phone away. Officer Two's mocking grin cracked, his eyes darting between her and his partner, sensing the sudden shift in the balance of power but too arrogant to understand it fully. On the other end, a brief silence. Then a voice thundered across the connection, deep and commanding, vibrating with an authority so sharp it could cut through steel. "Who is she that you think you can detain her?" The words didn't merely echo. They detonated in the space, crashing into the officers with a force they had never known. General Walter's voice carried the weight of entire battlefields, the finality of a gavel swallowing the sky. Officer Huang staggered back half a step, sweat beading along his hairline, his mouth twitching as he fumbled for a response that refused to come. Officer Two's breath hitched in his throat, the mockery draining from his face as he stared at her, eyes wide with dawning horror. She did not move, her eyes locked forward, phone an extension of her resolve, her posture a statue of righteous fury. In that instant, she transformed from a lone figure standing against oppression into an unmovable monument to every silent struggle, every quiet sacrifice. Officer One tried to speak, lips parting around words that refused to form, his confidence fracturing like cheap glass under a hammer. Officer Two's hand hovered uselessly near his holster, fingers trembling as if finally realizing the weapon he clung to was nothing against the power she wielded with a single call. The voice from the phone crackled again, deeper, colder now. "Release her immediately." The command held no room for negotiation, each syllable saturated with absolute power. The gas station seemed to shrink around them, the sun beating down like a relentless spotlight, exposing every crack in their fragile armor. She lowered the phone slowly, her gaze sweeping over them with an icy clarity that left no doubt about who truly held control. In that fragile, charged quiet, she stood taller, her uniform gleaming, her breath steady and fierce. Their sneers and cheap insults had evaporated, replaced by a raw, unfiltered fear that dripped from their every twitch. She had turned the battlefield inside out without ever raising her voice, proving that true power doesn't scream, it resonates, deep and unyielding, echoing long after the moment passes. They watched closely, To detect the command from the phone still reverberated through the air like a thunderclap that refused to fade. And Officer One's once cocky smirk melted into something twisted and brittle, a grotesque mask of disbelief clawing at his features. His fingers fumbled with her ID, now nothing more than a meaningless plastic card in his trembling grasp. His eyes darted around, searching desperately for an escape route that did not exist, his confidence unraveling strand by strand. Briefly, his fingers dragged over one stitch from the floor, kept scratching his skin, his confidence unraveling strand by strand. Officer 2 shifted his weight anxiously, sweat dripping down his temple in erratic streams, his gaze snapping from her to his partner and back again, each glance more panicked than the last. The two men stood exposed beneath the searing sun, their arrogance dissolving into a quivering fear they could no longer disguise. Officer White, one pretended to clear his throat, forcing a thin laugh that sounded like glass scraping against metal. He stole a glance at his phone, his thumb moving shakily across the screen as he searched for any scrap of information that could explain the storm they had unleashed. The moment his eyes met the search results, color drained from his face, as if every ounce of blood had been sucked out by an invisible hand. He looked up, his lips parting but no words coming, the weight of realization anchoring him to the spot. Officer 2's knees flexed involuntarily, his shoulders tensing under the crushing weight of a truth he hadn't expected. The smirk that had once curled on his lips had completely vanished, replaced by a thin line of dread. He shifted again, his fingers twitching at his belt, not in threat this time, but in nervous self-soothing. His mind raced in chaotic spirals, unable to grasp how one phone call, one calm, measured voice on the other end, could obliterate the fortress of power he thought untouchable. She stood unmoving, her gaze fixed on them with a quiet ferocity that glowed brighter than any shout or curse ever could. Her breathing was steady, each inhale a declaration of control, each exhale a silent decree of power they could neither match nor diminish. They watched her as if seeing her for the first time, no longer a woman they could intimidate, but a towering monument of unyielding resolve. Officer 1 tried to piece together some semblance of authority, clearing his throat again, his voice catching as he mumbled, This isn't necessary, ma'am." The pathetic attempt at civility scraped against the raw tension, only deepening the crack in his composure. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her voice emerging calm and glacial as a winter wind. "Your duty is not to judge others." The words sliced through them, precise and final, leaving no room for retort. The simplicity of her statement struck harder than any accusation, forcing them to confront the chasm between their imagined power and her true command. Officer 2, one clutched his phone so tightly his knuckles turned ghostly white, the screen flickering as if echoing his internal chaos. He glanced at his partner, hoping for support, but found only a mirror reflecting the same disintegration. Officer 2 swallowed hard, throat bobbing visibly, his eyes darting back to her with a haunted awareness that they had stumbled far beyond their depth. The silence between them thickened, an invisible wall that pressed down with punishing force. She stood in that silence, her posture a flawless sculpture of defiance and grace, her presence swallowing the entire scene whole. Every twitch, every forced breath from them only highlighted her unwavering calm, her absolute ownership of the moment. Their attempts at intimidation had turned to ashes in their mouths, every insult rebounding to expose their hollowness, every insult rebounding to expose their hollowness. The sun bore down mercilessly, illuminating every bead of sweat, every tremor of their failing facades. They shifted, squirmed, and hunted for an exit from the confrontation they had so eagerly sought moments before. But no door would open, no hand would save them from the truth that now caged them tighter than any prison cell. Her steady gaze held them frozen, a final verdict echoing in her unwavering eyes. They had already lost, and as they stood trapped in their unraveling illusions, they could only watch her, powerless to stop the surge of justice she embodied, each heartbeat of hers a silent war drum they could never silence. The weight of her unwavering gaze still pierced them when General Walters's voice thundered again from the phone, his words striking with the precision of a missile. "Release her immediately and prepare for your suspension," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, each syllable a crushing blow to their fragile authority. Officer One's face twisted into a grotesque attempt at composure, his lips curling awkwardly as he struggled to hold onto any shred of control. His fingers trembled around his phone, his breath shallow and ragged, betraying the cyclone tearing through his mind. Officer Two's jaw clenched so hard the veins on his neck pulsed visibly, his eyes darting around as if hoping the earth would open and swallow him whole. They exchanged a frantic glance, a silent, shared realization that the power they had clung to moments before had evaporated into nothing but thin, mocking air. Officer One tried to force a smirk, but it contorted into a painful grimace, a pitiful mask slipping down his sweaty face. He shifted on his feet, his knees weak, the arrogant bravado that had defined him now reduced to a hollow echo bouncing helplessly inside his skull. Officer Two stepped back slightly, his eyes wide with animal panic, his hand twitching near his belt in a pathetic, instinctive motion that only amplified his impotence. She stood before them, her spine straight, shoulders square, her eyes two burning coals that swallowed their cowardice whole. Her calm was no longer just defiance, it had become an imperious command, a silent verdict that reverberated louder than any courtroom gavel. Her chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, each inhale drawing in their crumbling facade, each exhale releasing a quiet, unstoppable power that made the very air quake. Officer Unspoken quivered as he stammered, his voice a pitiful ghost of its former menace. I'm sorry, ma'am." The apology dripped from his mouth like spoiled wine, too late, too empty to heal the wounds he had carved. His eyes flickered to her face, desperate for a flicker of mercy that would never come. Officer One too shifted again, his feet scuffing against the hot pavement, his mouth opening as if to add something, but no sound dared escape. The screech of tires cut through the tense air as another police cruiser tore into the station, the siren's final wails echoing like a funeral march for the officer's authority. The car door swung open with a force that mirrored the storm crashing through the officers' minds. The precinct captain stepped out, his expression carved from stone, eyes cold and merciless. "Me." He swept the scene in a single glance, taking in the trembling officers, the unyielding soldier, and the trembling tension hanging like a blade. With a curt nod, he gestured at Officer One and Two, his voice low but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "You're done here. Get out of this area now." The words fell like hammers, smashing the last vestiges of their resistance. Officer One swallowed hard, his shoulders collapsing inward, his eyes empty pits as he shuffled backward, every step a testament to his complete and irrevocable defeat. Officer Two followed, his head bowed, the swagger that once infected his every move now nothing but a faded memory. She watched them leave, her gaze an unwavering beacon, her composure unbreakable, her silhouette an emblem of silent triumph. The captain paused beside her, his eyes momentarily meeting hers, and in that charged exchange there was no need for words. Her presence alone had shifted the entire landscape, turned the aggressors into the vanquished, turned them bare before the scorching judgment of truth. As the officers disappeared beyond the concrete horizon, she remained rooted, her breath calm, her pulse steady, her spirit a mountain immovable in its conviction. In that moment, she did not simply reclaim her dignity, she reclaimed the narrative, transformed the battleground into a testament of her power, a living monument to unyielding strength that would echo long after the sirens had faded into the unforgiving sun. As the sun continued its relentless climb above the gas station, the consequences unfurled with a deadly precision that neither officer could have predicted. In the sterile confines of the precinct, the walls seemed to close in on Officer One and Officer Two. the fluorescent lights above exposing every bead of sweat, every twitch of their restless fingers. Their uniforms, once symbols of unchecked authority, now felt like suffocating shrouds, heavy with shame and dread. Officer Winder paced the narrow hallway, his shoes echoing like a death knell, his mind clawing for excuses, rehearsing denials that crumbled as soon as they formed. He tried to rationalize, to shape the narrative into something less damning, but the truth loomed over him like a predator waiting to pounce. Officer and two slumped against the cold wall, his head bowed, eyes darting across the floor tiles, as if searching for a crack to slip through and disappear. The whispers from passing colleagues stabbed into him, sharp and merciless, each glance a blade slicing at the fragile veneer of his composure. The forceful jokes and arrogant laughter that once bonded them with other officers had evaporated, leaving behind only an icy silence, a chasm of betrayal and disgust. The officer, one's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, a frantic lifeline he clung to with trembling hands. He called in favors, voices he once believed loyal, but each reply was a cold, clipped dismissal. The thin thread of influence he thought unbreakable snapped with each rejection, leaving him dangling in a void of his own making. The smirk that had so effortlessly twisted across his face days before had now dissolved into a rictus of desperation, his lips dry and cracked as he mouthed silent curses into the sterile air. Officer 2 received the final blow in a curt, emotionless email, immediate termination pending investigation. The words scorched his mind, his vision blurring as he read them over and over, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into salvation, but the meaning remained, stark and inescapable. His breath came in shallow bursts, panic clawing at his throat like a feral animal. The camaraderie he had leaned on turned to smoke, the handshakes and shoulder claps now phantoms, leaving him exposed and utterly alone. In a last-ditch act of defiance, Officer 1 pressed redial on his phone, his voice trembling as he begged, whispered, promised anything to those in power. But the doors he had always assumed would open at his command slammed shut with a definitive finality. His voice, once laced with cruel authority, now cracked under the weight of humiliation, every syllable a confession of failure. Across the precinct, hushed conversations bloomed like dark flowers, officers exchanging glances filled with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The narrative had flipped, the predators now cornered, their vulnerability laid bare for all to witness. Officer 1's shoulders sagged, his eyes bloodshot and wild, as he finally understood the irreversible magnitude of their action. Officer 2's knees buckled, forcing him to slide down the wall, his uniform wrinkling, a pitiful echo of the power it once projected. They were ghosts of the men who had swaggered through the gas station, their arrogance evaporated, leaving behind husks defined only by fear and regret. Each breath they took seemed to echo the finality of their downfall, each heartbeat a countdown to a reckoning they could no longer outrun. Meanwhile, outside that suffocating tomb of fluorescent light and silent judgment, she stood tall, her presence a ripple cutting through the stagnant waters of corruption. Her calm had dismantled an empire of bravado in a single morning, and as their worlds collapsed inward, her power only solidified, shining bright against their crumbling facades. In their downfall, the first seeds of a much larger transformation had taken root, a promise that no smirk, no whispered slur could ever bury again. The shockwaves from the precinct had barely settled when the digital storm erupted, a relentless tidal wave of outrage, crashing across every screen, every timeline. Video footage of the encounter, captured from shaky phone cameras and security feeds, spread with the speed of wildfire, igniting hearts and boiling blood in cities and towns far beyond the gas station's cracked pavement. The clips captured every venom-laced insult, every mocking smirk, and every unwavering second of her defiance, painting a portrait that seared itself into the collective consciousness. Hashtags multiplied like sparks, words dripping with anger and solidarity, coiling together into a singular, thunderous demand for justice. Soldiers, veterans, and civilians alike flooded comment sections, their voices rising in a relentless chorus that shattered the fragile walls of complacency. They saw her not just as a lone soldier, but as the embodiment of every silent battle they had fought, every insult swallowed, every injustice endured. The faces behind the keyboards transformed into a unified legion, their words battering down institutional barricades with a force more potent than fists or guns. Her image, rigid spine, unflinching gaze, became a rallying cry, a living emblem pinned across avatars and profile pictures as a vow to never stand down again. Human rights organizations pounced, their statements sharp as razors, demanding immediate investigations and systematic overhauls. Their leaders filled press conferences with scorching indictments, words chosen like bullets aimed at the rotten heart of a system that had too long thrived on shadows and whispers. In every speech, her name rose like a banner, her story the proof of festering wounds that could no longer be hidden beneath bureaucratic bandages. On the ground, the energy transformed from virtual flame to pounding feet and raised fists. Protesters flooded the streets. Bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in a tide of righteous fury. The sun blazed down on homemade signs, ink running like war paint under the weight of tears and sweat. Outside the police headquarters, a massive sea of people roared, their chants crashing against the walls, each syllable a hammer blow to the fortress of indifference. Justice for all! No more silence! The words vibrated in the air, a living pulse that set the city's heart pounding in rhythm with theirs. In the chaos, her figure emerged as more than a symbol. She became a living promise, a sentinel, watching over the furious tide. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words carried the quiet power of thunder rolling across a midnight plain. Her composure under the camera lens was as sharp and resolute as it had been in the gas station, her gaze piercing through microphones and lights straight into the soul of a nation gasping for accountability. Reporters jostled for her words, each soundbite dissected and amplified into echoing war cries across television screens and radio waves. Every carefully spoken sentence drew lines in the sand, demanding that the world pick a side, complicity or change. The cracks in the old facade of law enforcement deepened, pieces falling away with each viral clip, each statement from a general or community leader, each march that rumbled through downtown streets like an advancing army. In living rooms and barracks alike, people watched, breathless, as her defiance transcended her singular story. She had become a lighthouse in a storm, a beacon no gust of institutional denial could extinguish. Her name became a chant, her image a shield, her story a sword wielded by thousands who refused to be silenced any longer. And as the days turned, as nights echoed with chants and candles burned down to trembling stubs, it was clear. This was no fleeting moment of outrage, but the birth cry of a movement determined to rip out the roots of injustice once and for all. The echo of the chants outside had barely faded when the cold, sterile walls of the Internal Affairs conference room closed in like a vice. Officer 1 and Officer 2 sat under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, their uniforms now nothing more than costumes that could no longer shield them from the storm they had unleashed. Files piled high on the polished table, each page a silent indictment, each photograph a frozen moment of truth they could no longer dodge. Their eyes darted from one another to the seasoned investigators lining the room, every glance dripping with judgment sharper than a blade. The precinct captain, a towering figure with a stare as unyielding as winter, stood at the head of the table, his voice a chilling monotone that left no refuge. "You have been under observation for months," he declared, his words punctuated by the slap of files hitting the table. "Your actions today were not isolated. They were the inevitable crescendo of a pattern we can no longer ignore." His accusation landed with the weight of a falling guillotine, slicing away any last defense they might have clung to. Officer Proke leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned to pale marble. His voice broke as he stammered excuses, a pitiful symphony of half-formed justifications. "We were doing our jobs. We thought she was a threat. The words dissolved into the sterile air, lifeless and transparent, as investigators scribbled notes with methodical calm. Every syllable he uttered only deepened the crater beneath him. His protestations echoed in a vacuum, no longer willing to listen. Officer Two's face twisted with a sneer, his bitterness now turned inward and weaponized against the partner he had once shadowed so faithfully. "This is your fault," he snapped, voice low and venomous. "You pushed it too far. You wanted to show off. Now look at us." The room trembled with the silent impact of betrayal. The fragile alliance between them shattered into shards that cut deeper than any blade. Officer Warden recoiled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish dragged onto a dock. The realization that his last ally had become his executioner sinking into his hollow chest. The captain watched them unravel, his arms crossed, eyes glacial and unblinking. Questions rained down from the panel, each one meticulously crafted to peel back the layers of arrogance and reveal the rotting core beneath. Why did you deviate from protocol? Why did you target her specifically? When did you decide intimidation was your first tool? Each inquiry hit like a hammer, relentless and precise, leaving no space for evasion. Officer Two's forehead glistened, sweat pooling in the hollow of his collar as he stammered replies that sounded weaker with every breath. His gaze flickered to the exit, but there was no escape, only the reflection of his guilt in the glass walls. Officer Two shook his head, lips curled in disgust, as if trying to distance himself from the sinking ship, even while the waves of consequence crashed over them both. Documents were pushed forward, damning records of previous complaints, community testimonies, and internal warnings they had laughed off as meaningless reprimands. Each page turned was another nail hammered into the coffin of their careers. Officer One's face drained of color, his chest rising and falling in erratic rhythm, as if he were drowning on dry land. Officer Two leaned back, his eyes unfocused, a haunted emptiness swallowing whatever defiance once fueled his smirk. In that room, stripped of uniforms and illusions, they were not protectors but perpetrators, exposed to the blinding scrutiny of justice they had once so casually denied others. The finality of their ruin loomed over them like a thunderhead, dark and inescapable. And beyond those glass walls, the storm they had ignited churned on, fed by the righteous fury of a community that would no longer be silenced. The investigation pressed on, each question a scalpel, cutting deeper, each answer a desperate gasp. There was no redemption waiting in the wings, no shadowy benefactor to whisk them away, only the echo of their cowardice, reverberating in the sterile chamber, sealed their fate as the last illusions crumbled to dust. The suffocating weight of consequence settled over Officer One and Officer Two like a shroud, each breath tasting of dread and finality. The notification arrived in a stark, sterile envelope, its contents a death sentence to the lives they had carefully constructed from arrogance and violence. The words "disciplinary action pending termination" burned across the page, each letter a blade slicing away any last shred of imagined invincibility. Officer Cleote, one clutched the document with trembling fingers, his eyes darting across the lines in manic desperation, as if searching for a hidden loophole, a secret passage out of the abyss. But there was none. The cold official language gave no quarter, offered no mercy. He tried to speak, his voice a pitiful rasp that cracked under the strain. Pleas for forgiveness spilled out, disjointed and pitiful, each one dying before it could find an ear willing to listen. His colleagues, once his echo chamber of cruelty and smirks, turned away with disgust, their silence more damning than 1,000 shouted condemnations. His words fell into a void, each syllable another nail sealing the coffin of his career. Officer Two sat frozen, the document limp in his lap, eyes wide and vacant as if staring into a chasm only he could see. His mind twisted and buckled under the realization that the badge he had wielded as a weapon had now become a millstone dragging him into oblivion. Every breath was shallow, each heartbeat a heavy toll counting down to the inevitable collapse of the world he had once dominated so easily. His fingers twitched against the edge of the paper, desperate to hold on to something real, something solid, but everything had turned to dust beneath his touch. Meanwhile, beyond their private purgatory, she stepped forward into a different arena. The conference room for the police reform summit was a battlefield of its own, lined with hardened faces and restless stares. She entered with the same quiet authority that had turned concrete into her throne, her footsteps echoing not just in the room but in the hearts of those who now looked to her for direction. Her uniform caught the overhead lights, each insignia a silent testament to the battles she had fought and the battles yet to come. She did not hesitate. Her voice rose steady and unwavering, slicing through the murmurs and undercutting every half-formed protest before they could gather breath. She called not just for an investigation into her treatment, but for an uncompromising systemic reckoning across every precinct, every badge, every hidden corridor of corruption that had long festered beneath polite smiles and polished shoes. Her words carried the weight of an entire community's anguish and the bright, cutting edge of a future that refused to be delayed. The room shifted under her presence, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward, caught in the gravity of her conviction. She was no longer just a soldier. She had become an unyielding force, a tidal wave that no barricade could hold back. Her gaze swept the room. Each set of eyes she met forced to confront their complicity or cowardice. There was no refuge in half measures, no safety in empty rhetoric. Her demand was clear: transform or be swept away. Back in the shadows, Officer 1 clawed at any possible lifeline, his calls unanswered, his messages read and ignored. The echo of his begging voice was a cruel soundtrack to his disintegration. The world he had once dominated now folding inward to crush him in its final embrace. Officer 2, his mouth dry and eyes sunken, accepted in a sudden, shivering clarity that the uniform had never been armor but a fragile illusion now shattered at his feet. Their downfall was not quiet. It rang in the silence of empty hallways, screamed in the judgmental stares of former allies, and reverberated in every tremor of their shaking hands. The fortress they had built from fear and force crumbled under the unstoppable advance of a single woman's resolve, her steady march turning them from predators into prey, from men into hollow echoes of their former selves. As the final hours of their careers ticked away, her star only rose higher, a blazing testament to the power of a single, unwavering voice to crack even the most fortified walls. In the shadows of their collapse, she stood unmovable, a living monument to accountability, each breath a silent challenge to a system that had believed itself untouchable for far too long. Their downfall, once a whisper in back halls, roared into the public square with unstoppable force. The official announcement spread across headlines and tickers like a lightning strike in a dry forest. Both officers had been terminated, stripped of their badges, and paraded as living proof that no shield could protect bigotry forever. The footage of their final walk out of the precinct, heads bowed, uniforms reduced to empty cloth, played on repeat, a public shaming so thorough it left scars deeper than any courtroom sentence. Communities that had long simmered with quiet anger now surged forward in a flood of collective catharsis. Human rights groups and local activists organized a massive vigil, a sea of candles flickering against the velvet night, each flame a whispered name of someone lost to hatred and silence. Old veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with teenagers, mothers clasped the hands of strangers, and the divisions that once fractured them dissolved in shared grief and fierce hope. Speeches rang out, words igniting like sparks, each story threading into a tapestry of collective resilience. At the center of every chant, her name rose like a star, luminous and unstoppable. She stepped onto a stage built not of marble or power, but of pure will and righteous defiance. Cameras zoomed in as she took a steady breath, her uniform sharp under the stage lights, her eyes bright with the weight of battles fought and yet to come. In the live interview broadcast to millions, her voice carried not just words, but seismic force. "This isn't about one uniform, one rank, or even one woman," she declared, each syllable a thunderclap. "It's about a promise that justice belongs to all of us, and that no one, no matter how powerful they believe they are, can stand above it." Her message echoed far beyond the screen, embedding itself into living rooms, locker rooms, and boardrooms alike. Even the most hardened cynics felt the cracks form, forced to reckon with the truth that had long stalked them like a silent predator. Across the nation, police departments scrambled to reassess, meetings erupted in urgent whispers, and city officials drafted statements that tasted like ash in their mouths. Meanwhile, the disgraced officers found no refuge in anonymity. Their names scrawled endlessly across news tickers, their faces frozen in expressions of regret and disbelief. They had become living warnings, examples of what happens when power is wielded without humanity. Their apologies, issued through trembling lips, and legal statements evaporated into the public's cold, unyielding scrutiny. No handshake, no whispered favor, no forgotten file could save them from the tidal wave of accountability now crashing over their heads. Communities began to heal in cautious, trembling steps. Each candle at the vigil a vow that this would not be another forgotten chapter. Statues were unveiled, honoring those who had stood their ground, who had refused to bow to injustice. And in the middle of every tribute stood her story as an immortal flame. She did not claim to be a savior, she stood as a mirror, reflecting the courage lying dormant in each soul, daring them to act, to rise. As the night deepened and chants turned into murmurs beneath the stars, the narrative shifted. The conclusion was not an end, but a genesis, a breath drawn before a larger roar. Her silhouette against the candlelit crowd became a promise carved into the marrow of a nation, that justice, once awakened, would not sleep again. The final echo of her broadcast, as she turned her gaze toward the camera one last time, her eyes carried the unspoken vow of a future rebuilt, not on fear, but on fierce, unbreakable solidarity. The city exhaled, the world listened, and for the first time in far too long, justice felt not like a distant dream, but a living, breathing reality. The candlelit chants still echoed through city streets when a new fire ignited, hotter and more demanding than the first spark. The footage, already a relentless tide online, turned into a hurricane of hashtags, reposts, and furious commentary. Screens across the country glowed with her image, her steely gaze a silent command that reverberated in bedrooms, war rooms, and halls of power alike. Under the weight of a nation's collective roar, the government had no choice but to act. An internal investigation was announced, its scope massive, its promises sweeping. The public demanded not just accountability, but an exorcism of the rotted core that had poisoned their trust for too long. She stepped onto a makeshift stage in front of City Hall, her figure framed by floodlights and a sea of fists held high. Her voice rang out like a drumbeat echoing across a battlefield. "Justice is not a gift," she declared, each word slicing through the noise with surgical precision. "It is a right, one we must fight for, protect, and refuse to surrender." The crowd erupted in a volcanic roar, their rage and resolve crystallizing into something unbreakable. They were no longer passive witnesses. They had become an army forged in betrayal and indignation, ready to dismantle whatever stood in their way. Inside precinct walls, panic spread like a disease. Officers once shielded by silence now felt the icy fingers of public scrutiny clawing at their doors. Long hallway glances turned to pointed stares. Hurried conversations dropped into uncomfortable silence whenever a known name passed. The fortress of loyalty fractured overnight, leaving traitorous cracks for the truth to slip through. Officer 1 and Officer 2 were summoned once more, this time not to bark orders or flaunt authority, but to face a tribunal hungry for answers and blood. The interrogation room felt colder, smaller than ever, every ticking second a reminder of their spiraling descent. officer. One leaned forward, desperation written in every deep line of his face. He spoke with the forced calm of a drowning man pretending he could still swim. "I was doing my job," he insisted, voice thin, cracking at the edges. "She posed a threat. We followed protocol, but each lie, each excuse hung in the air like rancid smoke, dissipating before it could cling to anything solid. The panel of investigators, eyes sharp and unyielding, pressed him relentlessly, their questions scalpel sharp, exposing layer after layer of rot. Officer 2 shifted in his seat, sweat soaking his collar as he tried to control the tremor in his fingers. He turned on his partner with a venom that surprised even the investigators. "You wanted this," he spat, his voice a low snarl, vibrating with betrayal and self-preservation. "You pushed too far, and now we're both in this mess." His words tore through the room, an unceremonious confession that echoed louder than any official verdict. Officer 1 recoiled, his eyes wide, the thin veneer of brotherhood evaporating in the heat of exposure. Outside, the storm only gained momentum. Marches doubled in size overnight, each new protest more defiant, more precise in its demands. Banners painted in furious strokes screamed for reform, their words slicing across the skyline like lightning. Community leaders joined her, amplifying her message in interviews that played on every screen, their voices woven into a single, unstoppable chorus. A high-ranking police official emerged from the shadows, a man who had long played puppet master behind closed doors. His attempts to downplay the incident and shield his department with vague statements and hollow apologies fell apart under the sheer weight of the evidence now flooding the public sphere. Each carefully crafted press release crumbled in real time as activists dissected every line, shredding his credibility like paper in a storm. His efforts to cleanse the narrative only poured gasoline on an already raging fire, solidifying his image as yet another cog in a machine designed to protect itself rather than the people it claimed to serve. Interviews with former officers surfaced, each testimony a dagger thrust into the crumbling body of a system that had believed itself immortal. Stories of intimidation, corruption, and buried complaints spilled out, each more damning than the last, painting a portrait of a force addicted to its unchecked power. The public, once forced to whisper their fears behind closed doors, now roared them into the daylight, each voice another hammer blow against the fortress of complicity. Amid this chaos, she remained a steady beacon, her calm not mistaken for passivity, but recognized as a deeper, indestructible strength. Each time she spoke, it felt like an earthquake under the feet of those clinging to the old ways. In one viral interview, she stared directly into the camera, eyes aflame with conviction. "If you are silent, you are complicit," she said, her voice low and thunderous. "We will not accept silence. We will not accept fear. We will not be erased." Her words carried across airwaves and seep into the very bones of a movement that now felt unstoppable. School children recited her quotes and classrooms turned makeshift forums for justice. Veterans marched with her name stitched onto their jackets, each thread a promise to carry forward the fire she had lit. Elderly women stood at the front lines of protests, their voices hoarse but unbowed, holding signs that simply read, "We see you, we believe you, we fight with you." Back in the interrogation room, Officer 1 and Officer 2 squirmed, their words drying up as if their tongues had turned to ash. The panel pressed on, an unrelenting tide of questions and accusations that stripped away their defenses until all that remained were two hollow shells, echoes of men who once wielded fear like a blade. They looked at each other now not as allies, but as co-conspirators, trapped in a final, inescapable reckoning. Every attempt to pivot, every feeble justification, only tightened the noose of public and institutional condemnation. The official overseeing the internal inquiry finally spoke, his voice as cold and final as a steel trap snapping shut. "Your actions have not only violated policy, but have undermined the very foundation of trust this department pretends to uphold. You are finished." The words reverberated in their skulls, an inescapable sentence that crushed whatever embers of arrogance remained. Outside those sterile walls, her message burned brighter than any headline. She became more than a soldier, more than a symbol. She became the embodiment of a collective vow to never kneel again. The community, once fractured and afraid, now surged forward as a singular force, each step forward echoing her declaration that justice was not a gift to be handed down from ivory towers, but a right wrested from the grip of those who would deny it. By the time the sun rose on the next day, the city felt different. The air tasted of resolve and renewed purpose. The statues of old heroes seemed to lean forward, as if listening to a new anthem pulsing through the streets. Children painted murals of her, their tiny hands dragging bright colors across concrete walls, sketching out a future that belonged to them all. This was no longer just her fight. It was theirs. It was everyone's. And as the city trembled under the collective march of millions of feet, the echo of her voice rose above the noise, a final, unbreakable vow. We are not done. We are just beginning. The dawn broke over a city that now pulsed with restless anticipation, each ray of sunlight slicing through alleys and high-rise shadows like a scalpel uncovering hidden wounds. Inside the marble halls of the central courthouse, the air thickened with unspoken questions and electric tension as the official investigation launched in full force. The world watched, breathless, as the woman who had stood unbowed beneath the scorching sun now stood under a different spotlight, the cold, unwavering gaze of the law. She arrived at the courthouse flanked by a team that reflected her quiet strength, calm, sharp-eyed, every step purposeful. Her uniform, freshly pressed and gleaming under the harsh lights, felt less like fabric and more like armor forged from each battle she had fought. The murmurs of onlookers coiled around her, whispers that carried awe and fear in equal measure. When she entered the courtroom, the hush that fell was so complete it felt as if the building itself held its breath. Her testimony cut through the stagnant air like a blade. Each word she spoke rang with crystalline clarity, her recounting not just of what was done to her but what it symbolized, an indictment of a system built to oppress, to belittle, to erase. She did not flinch, did not soften her words to spare fragile egos. Her gaze swept over the room with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything yet to claim. The prosecutors leaned in, hanging onto each syllable as if it were a life raft in a sea of corruption. In a starkly different corner, Officer 1 sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck throbbed. He tried to meet her stare, but found only a mirror to his own unraveling soul. His attempt to spin his narrative, to repaint himself as a loyal servant merely following orders, came out hollow and pathetic. The panel's questions sliced into his defenses, each one a surgical strike exposing his hypocrisy and violence. His words, once weapons that silenced and subdued, now hung limp and lifeless in the stale courtroom air. Officer 2 fared no better. Seated beside his former ally, his posture sagged with a mixture of fatigue and defeat. He shifted constantly, eyes darting to the floor, the walls, anywhere but the woman whose voice now condemned him more thoroughly than any sentence ever could. Colleagues he had once shared smirks and secrets with now avoided his gaze, their silence a verdict louder than any gavel strike. Whispers spread like wildfire beyond the courtroom walls. Stories of past misconduct, abuses swept under the rug, each revelation another weight dragging him deeper into the mire. Desperation clawed at Officer 1 as he sought alliances in high places. He reached out to a well-connected official, hoping for a lifeline, a promise of quiet absolution in exchange for loyalty long since corrupted. The official's reply was swift and merciless, a curt rejection, a slammed door echoing through marble halls and into the hollow chambers of his mind. In that single denial, the brittle scaffolding of his imagined invincibility crumbled. leaving him exposed and shivering under the stark glare of justice. Meanwhile, she moved like a tide that refused to retreat. In a sun-drenched office lined with books and legal tomes, she met with a renowned civil rights attorney known for dismantling monoliths of corruption one brick at a time. Their conversation, though quiet, hummed with energy. Each exchanged glance, a strategy forged. Each nod, a hammer poised to strike. Her resolve fused seamlessly with his legal acumen, crafting a blueprint not just for her defense, but for an all-out offensive against the rot that had festered unseen for generations. As rumors of this alliance spread, the pressure within the police force reached a fever pitch. Officers who had once hidden behind procedural jargon and locker room bravado found themselves under a microscope. The community's watchful eye now turned on every handshake, every sidelong glance, every late-night phone call. No corner felt safe, no ally guaranteed. Files long forgotten were pulled from dusty archives, each page a potential landmine threatening to explode beneath careless feet. The informal investigations birthed within precinct walls revealed festering secrets, misconduct reports buried under layers of bureaucracy, video footage selectively edited or vanished, testimonies coerced or dismissed with cynical efficiency. Officers who had once toasted to a brotherhood of silence now whispered confessions in darkened corridors, the fear of exposure outweighing any misplaced loyalty. Names once protected under blue shields now spilled into the public, each revelation fueling a fire too massive to smother. Officer Two's isolation grew sharper by the hour. He wandered the hallways like a specter, his badge now a brand of disgrace rather than a shield of honor. Conversations would snap shut at his approach, doors closed with a finality that reverberated through his hollow chest. Rumors of his past transgressions, whispered insults, unlawful searches, a string of unnecessary force complaints, all clawed their way to the surface, each one puncturing his crumbling facade. He understood now that there would be no last-minute salvation, no quiet reassignment to a friendlier precinct. There was only the free fall, unending and absolute. Through it all, she stood at the eye of the storm, calm and unwavering. Her public statements were measured but laced with an iron core. In one nationally broadcast interview, she looked directly into the camera, her eyes burning with the weight of collective memory and future promise. "We will not settle for scraps of reform," she said, her voice deep and resonant. "We demand a reckoning so profound it rewrites the very foundation of this system. We demand a future where justice is not rationed, but a right unassailable and uncompromised." Her words ignited a fresh wave of support, the community transforming its rage into organized demands. Policy drafts, citizen review boards, independent oversight committees, each step a hammer driving nails into the coffin of systemic denial. Each rally, each town hall, each online campaign crystallized her message into an unstoppable momentum. Even those once content to watch from the sidelines found themselves swept into the current, compelled to choose between complicity and transformation. Behind closed doors, the high-ranking official who had dismissed Officer One's plea orchestrated frantic meetings, desperate to maintain control of a narrative slipping through trembling fingers. His efforts to sanitize reports and manipulate press conferences only accelerated his downfall, each lie exposed before it could even breathe. Leaked emails, secret memos, off-the-record conversations, every hidden move detonated in public view, each explosion echoing across headlines and into homes like thunderclaps heralding a new dawn. The final portrait emerging was damning and irreversible, a force addicted to power, rotting from the inside out, and no longer immune to consequence. And in every headline, every mural, every chant screamed into the night, her face remained, unwavering and luminous. She had not merely survived, she had transformed, weaponizing her pain and her truth into a spear that pierced the very heart of a broken institution. As the investigation deepened and the ripples of her defiance radiated outward, a singular truth took hold. This was no longer a singular battle for one woman's justice. It was a war for the soul of a nation, a relentless campaign to drag truth into the harsh light and force it to stand trial. And at the helm, she stood immovable, her voice now an anthem, echoing through courthouses and schoolyards and across every trembling precinct hallway, a clarion call none could ignore and all would remember. As the investigations carved deeper into the rotting core of the force, Officer 1 and Officer 2 found themselves marooned on an island of their own making. Hallways that once echoed with their boisterous laughter now fell silent at their approach, conversations slicing off mid-sentence as though an invisible blade had severed every remaining thread of camaraderie. The cafeteria, once their stage for backslaps and shared smirks, turned into a silent arena of icy stares and turnbacks. Their footsteps rang loud and hollow, each step another reminder of the fortress of loyalty they had believed indestructible, now reduced to rubble under the relentless march of truth. Officer Prewile. One moved with the twitchy paranoia of a cornered animal, eyes flickering constantly, searching for any sign of an ally willing to risk standing beside him. He reached out to old political contacts, whispering pleas for protection, desperate bargains dripping with desperation, and thinly veiled threats. Each call was answered with an echo of disinterest, each email ignored or returned with curt, soulless reply. The once friendly handshakes that had opened doors now closed like steel traps, severing every lifeline he had clung to with white-knuckled desperation. Officer 2 spiraled into a different darkness. Threats poured in. Handwritten notes slipped into his locker. Voicemails laced with venom and finality. The community he once patrolled now saw him as a pariah, a monster stripped of his uniform's thin armor. Windows rattled with rocks thrown under the cover of night. Shadows shifting in alleys, faces glaring from across gas station aisles. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes carving into his skin, dissecting every twitch, every nervous glance. The fear that once belonged to others now coursed through his veins, an intimate poison he could neither purge nor deny. Meanwhile, she rose like a dawn that refused to be ignored. Her face became a symbol, stitched into banners, projected onto skyscrapers during rallies, etched into murals that bloomed overnight on forgotten brick walls. Her words reverberated through talk shows, podcasts, and town halls, each phrase a rallying cry that transcended the airwaves and burrowed into the nation's collective spine. She didn't chase the spotlight, it sought her out, gravitating toward the gravitational pull of her unbreakable spirit. Back inside the precinct, Officer 1 watched from a dim office window as crowds chanted her name, their thunderous chorus a battering ram against every wall he tried to erect. The taste of defeat festered on his tongue, acrid and relentless. He imagined reaching for the phone, dialing one more lifeline, but the memory of rejection stung too deeply, the ghosts of every ignored call ringing in his ears. Officer 2 attempted to salvage slivers of dignity, but each public appearance, each attempt to plead his case, was drowned in an ocean of booze and scorn. His voice cracked under the pressure, turning to a whimper that vanished into the jeering tide. Former colleagues crossed streets to avoid him, averted their eyes when forced into the same room, their silence a collective verdict he could not appeal. Amid this public reckoning, she stood at the helm of a historic meeting on police reform. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as city officials, legal experts, and community leaders filled the seats, each face etched with tension and anticipation. When she entered, the room fell into a reverent hush, the kind reserved for warriors returning from battlefields. She took her seat at the head of the table, her gaze sharp enough to slice through any pretense. Her presence alone forced every participant to confront the raw, unvarnished truth they had long avoided. She spoke without tremor, each sentence a deliberate strike. Accountability cannot be a slogan, she declared, her voice rising and falling like a war drum. It must be a living principle, an uncompromising standard by which every badge, every oath is measured. The room shifted under her words, some leaning forward, their hearts igniting with renewed purpose. Others squirmed, the spotlight of her convictions scorching away their comfortable illusion. Media cameras captured every angle, Live feeds streamed her every word into living rooms and onto phones clutched in trembling hands. She laid out proposals for independent oversight, mandatory body cameras, civilian review boards with actual teeth, each point a nail hammered into the coffin of complacency. Her vision was not one of incremental fixes, but a full metamorphosis, a demand that the system shed its skin and be reborn in the crucible of public trust. Outside, crowds cheered, the sound rolling up the skyscrapers and echoing back like a promise. Banners danced in the wind, each one a tapestry of defiance and hope woven with threads of pain, endurance, and the unwavering belief in something better. Children perched on shoulders chanted her name, their voices high and unyielding, a generation already primed to carry the torch she had ignited. Within precinct walls, Officer 1 and Officer 2 cowered under the weight of her ascension. Every second she stood stronger. They shrank further into the shadows of their own disgrace. Their once feared names now provoked only scornful laughter and pitying glances. The fortress they had believed impenetrable had collapsed into dust, each brick stamped with her defiant silhouette. As the meeting adjourned, she rose, her final words slicing through the air. "Change is not a gift we receive, it is a battle we fight, and it is a legacy we build." Applause thundered, not polite or perfunctory, but a primal roar of shared victory and collective resolve. In that moment, the tides of history shifted, and she stood at the center, an immovable force casting ripples that would reshape the future. The echo of that applause haunted Officer 1 and Officer 2 long after the lights dimmed, a phantom chorus reminding them of what they had lost and what she had forever claimed. The echo of her final words in the reform meeting had barely faded before the next battlefront unfolded, a battlefield of marble halls and gavel strikes where words and evidence would wield more power than fists ever could. With the unwavering resolve that had become her signature, she filed a lawsuit against Officer 1 and Officer 2, charging them with racial discrimination and violation of her civil rights. The headlines erupted like a controlled detonation, sending tremors through newsrooms and corner offices alike. Each article painted her not just as a survivor, but as a warrior, turning her pain into a spear pointed directly at the heart of institutional corruption. Officer 1 responded as a man drowning in his hubris would. He scrambled to assemble a team of the city's most expensive attorneys, a fortress of legal jargon and procedural smokescreens he believed could save him. But each meeting with his lawyers left him more rattled. Each strategy session another brick added to the walls closing in around him. His eyes grew hollow, the smirk he once wore as a badge now twisted into a desperate rictus. He clung to paperwork, legal precedents, anything that promised even a fleeting illusion of escape. But every piece of evidence, every witness statement bore down on him like an avalanche, unstoppable and merciless. Officer 2, on the other hand, dissolved into a shell of the man he once presented to the world. The cracks in his composure widened into chasms, swallowing what remained of his pride. Nightmares chased him through restless sleep, each dream a vivid replay of his cruel laughter, now echoed back to him in court filings and news footage. His steps turned into shuffles, his voice a whisper, barely audible even to himself. He began to understand in slow, crushing waves that his uniform had never been armor, only a fragile mask now shattered beyond repair. The court announced it would proceed with a full trial, each word from the judge ringing like a drumbeat of fate. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, cameras perpetually pointed at the grand doors, ready to capture every twitch, every tear, every moment when false confidence would finally collapse under the weight of truth. She walked into the courtroom as if into a war zone, her steps firm, her spine straight, her expression a blend of unyielding determination and quiet fury. Every seat was filled, every spectator leaning forward as though the oxygen in the room depended on her next move. She took the stand with a calmness that swallowed the entire space. Her testimony unfolded like a symphony, each word a deliberate note striking at the heart of her accuser's defenses. Her recounting wasn't just a story, it was a mirror held up to a nation's soul, forcing even the most cynical observer to confront the ugliness long buried under layers of excuses and denial. She did not falter. Her voice, clear and resonant, wrapped around every ear in the room, each phrase puncturing the fragile justifications Officer Prada 1 and Officer P2 clung to like debris in a flood. Officer number 1 watched, sweat beading on his forehead, his fingers clawing at the edge of the defense table as though he might physically hold back the tidal wave advancing toward him. His attorneys whispered frantically, scribbling notes, sliding documents toward him that he barely registered. Their strategies, once so precise and airtight in their sterile boardrooms, crumbled under the raw, undeniable force of her truth. His eyes darted to the gallery, searching for a friendly face, but found only grim observers and silent condemnation. Officer 2 sat slumped beside him, hands trembling, lips cracked and dry. He stared at the floor, each word from her mouth another nail hammered into the coffin of his already crumbling spirit. The realization that his career, his reputation, and his very identity had turned to ash coiled around him like a serpent, squeezing until each breath felt like a final gasp. Then, in a moment no one saw coming, a former colleague of Officer 1 stepped forward, breaking ranks from the blue wall of silence. The courtroom held its collective breath as this new witness took the stand, his face pale but his voice steady. He spoke of secret meetings, hushed agreements, moments of unchecked cruelty that even Officer 1 flinched to hear. His testimony detonated in the room like a grenade, each revelation a shockwave that stripped away the last shreds of Officer 1's defenses. Gasps rippled through the audience, reporters' pens scratching like frantic claws against notepads. Officer P's shoulders buckled, his head sinking toward the table as if the weight of his sins had finally grown too heavy to bear. His eyes glazed over, each syllable from his former ally hammering deeper into his psyche. Officer P turned his face away, unable to look at either his partner or the witness, his mind collapsing inward under the catastrophic implosion of their fabricated solidarity. She listened, head held high, her eyes never leaving the witness as he laid bare the malignant heart of a system that had once protected monsters like these. In her gaze shone no triumph, only a quiet, relentless commitment to a justice far greater than personal vindication. She had not come to merely punish. She had come to illuminate, to force the world to see every scar, every hidden cruelty, and to demand they never be hidden again. As the court recessed for the day, the city outside vibrated with a new kind of energy, a collective heartbeat synced to her unwavering cadence. Crowds gathered, eyes fixed on live updates, every headline another rallying cry. She exited the courthouse under a sky aflame with sunset, a living monument to the power of unwavering truth in a world built on fragile illusions. Her path forward was no longer hers alone. It was a highway carved through history, lit by every torch she had inspired others to raise. Inside, Officer 1 and Officer 2 sat in the gathering dusk of their own ruin, each breath now a curse, each memory a ghost that would never release them. Their dissent was no longer just public, it was eternal, written into the annals of a fight that would outlive them, echoing in every voice that refused to stay silent again. As the courtroom doors slammed shut behind the final gavel strike, an invisible tremor rolled outward, cracking the foundations of an institution that had long masqueraded as unassailable. The headlines didn't just capture a verdict, they ignited a wildfire. Across precincts, whispers evolved into confessions. Secrets, once buried beneath decades of silence, clawed their way into daylight. The entire force, once a monolith of arrogance and impunity, fractured under the collective weight of its own sins, now exposed like open wounds beneath a surgeon's lamp. Investigations sprouted like storm-driven weeds. Files that had gathered dust for years flew open, each page a damning testament to cruelty normalized and misconduct excused. Officers who had once swaggered through hallways now shuffled with downcast eyes, feeling the walls close in with every headline, every televised hearing. Supervisors who once defended the worst among them found themselves summoned before panels, their past decisions dissected under blinding light. Each hearing was a public autopsy, every word another cut into the flesh of a corrupt system struggling to breathe. Officer 1 and Officer 2 watched their worlds implode with the helpless terror of men trapped in a burning building. The pink slips came first, formal, cold, final. But termination was a mercy compared to the social execution that followed. Their names became synonymous with betrayal, not just to the public, but to the very colleagues they once believed shared an unbreakable code of silence. They were exiled from every professional circle, their friendships dissolved into vapor, their legacies reduced to cautionary tales recited in academic classrooms. As more officers fell under scrutiny, the old guard of the department turned on each other with savage desperation. Loyalty curdled into self-preservation. Brothers in arms transformed into informants, eager to barter someone else's secret for a scrap of salvation. Meetings, once thick with laughter and cruel jokes, now reeked of fear, each man wondering when the knock on his door would come. The illusion of unity shattered, revealing a hollow fraternity held together only by shared rot. While the police force convulsed, she moved through the world like a living blade. Letters from soldiers and veterans flooded her mailbox, each one a handwritten testament of solidarity. Many shared their own stories of harassment and discrimination, their words trembling with both pain and relief. Her name echoed through mess halls and training grounds, an anthem sung quietly at first, then aloud, until it rose into a chorus impossible to ignore. The Pentagon issued an official statement acknowledging her bravery and pledging to strengthen policies ensuring fair treatment across all branches. She accepted their recognition with the same poised dignity that had carried her through every confrontation. But behind her calm eyes burned a promise. This was not a victory lap, but the first stride in a much longer march. Public outrage rippled into policy. City councils and oversight boards convened emergency meetings, their agendas stripped of platitudes and instead heavy with the demands of a community no longer content to be placated. Citizens, once resigned to watching from the sidelines, filled council chambers and flooded online town halls, armed with questions sharp as knives. Each demanded reforms not as a favor, but as a debt long overdue. Each insisted that the rot be burned away root and stem, that the wounds be sutured with transparency and accountability, rather than half measures and empty apologies. Officer and Officer 2 retreated further into the shadows, their every attempt to reclaim even a sliver of their former lives met with doors slammed and voices raised in outrage. No department would touch them. No badge would shield them. Their disgrace had metastasized beyond their individual deeds, transforming them into the living effigies of a broken era now condemned to die. They became the face of a cancer finally identified and excised, objects of public scorn and private nightmares. The final blow came as the department itself issued a public apology, unprecedented, searing in its clarity. The statement named them directly, their crimes no longer hidden behind procedural shields or legal doublespeak. Their images, once framed with authority and respect, were broadcast alongside footage of protests and testimonies, a cruel juxtaposition that underlined their fall from unearned grace. In the quiet aftermath, she stood beneath the open sky, surrounded by fellow soldiers, many of whom bore scars, visible and invisible, from similar betrayals. One by one they approached, each handshake and embrace a silent benediction, each thank you heavy with the knowledge of battles yet to come. Her composure never wavered, but behind her eyes a storm gathered, a restless, righteous fury that had become her truest weapon. When she finally spoke, it was not with the fiery roar of a revolutionary, but with the clear, resonant calm of a commander addressing her troops. "This isn't the end," she declared, her voice carrying over the gathered crowd, settling into each heart like a vow. "It's the first dawn after a long, merciless night. We will not let darkness reclaim what we have won in blood, courage, and truth. The crowd erupted, not in wild cheers, but in a deep, resonant applause that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a pulse that carried for miles, echoing against the walls of the precincts now under siege from within. In that moment, every fracture in the police force, every toppled pedestal, every exposed lie, coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. The age of impunity was dying, and she was its herald. Her story, etched now into murals, into legislation, into the marrow of a society forced at last to look at itself, was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every silent soldier, every voiceless victim, every dreamer who believed that justice was not a gift, but a fight worth every scar. As the final echoes of that day faded, one certainty remained: the system would never be the same again. The final echoes of the force's collapse still shivered through city streets when she stepped forward once again, this time not as a lone survivor, but as a vanguard of something far greater. Her silhouette now moved beyond courtroom steps and rally stages. It advanced into legislative halls, boardrooms, and high-level strategy meetings, where real change had so often been suffocated under endless bureaucracy and cowardly compromise. She carried with her a presence forged from relentless defiance and battle-tested honor, every footfall echoing with the promise that her fight was no longer just for herself, but for a system gasping for redemption. Human rights organizations rallied to her side with unprecedented fervor, leaders and grassroots activists alike drawn by the gravitational force of her unbreakable resolve. Political figures who had once whispered platitudes from behind polished desks now found themselves dragged into the open, forced to choose between aligning with her blazing momentum or being left in the ashes of history. Her voice became a spear tip in the national dialogue, each phrase a clarion call slicing through the thick fog of excuses that had for too long insulated those in power from the consequences of their corruption. At the same time, further investigations plunged deeper into the festering rot left behind by Officer 1 and Officer 2. Their files, once shielded by layers of deceit and silent accomplices, spilled open like diseased wounds. Colleagues who had once laughed beside them now testified against them, voices shaking but clear, each confession a final nail hammered into their reputations already reduced to rubble, and the betrayals they had sown blossomed into a garden of damning evidence, each petal a story of cruelty, each stem a chain of silent complicity now broken beyond repair. In the heart of the capital, a national summit on police reform convened, attended by governors, senators, community leaders, and policy architects from across the nation. When she stepped onto that stage, the atmosphere coiled tight, an electric hush gripping the room as every gaze locked onto her. She didn't deliver a speech. She unleashed a manifesto. Her words ignited the space, blazing across minds and searing into hearts. She detailed proposals for independent civilian oversight, mandatory body cams with unrestricted public access, psychological evaluations re-administered at every rank, and sweeping disciplinary transparency that would once and for all shatter the fortress of unchecked authority. And the audience didn't just listen. They felt her words vibrate in their bones, each sentence a charge sent through the marrow of a society long addicted to looking away. As she spoke, live broadcasts relayed her demands into living rooms and handheld screens across the country. Families gathered in hushed awe. Activists scribbled notes feverishly, and young dreamers saw in her not just a leader, but an embodiment of their wildest hopes. Outside the summit, the city transformed into a living organism of protest and celebration. Crowds surged beneath massive digital billboards, streaming her speech in real time, their chants echoing in a synchronized heartbeat. Artists painted murals overnight, capturing her likeness mid-sentence, eyes aflame with purpose, mouth caught in an eternal rallying cry. The air vibrated with a single unified message: enough was enough. Behind those walls, Officer 1 and Officer 2, now subjects of even deeper scrutiny, shrank further into oblivion. Their every remaining secret was unearthed and paraded in public forums. The final confessions of former colleagues dripped like acid, each revelation a fresh blow that further sealed their fate. They had become symbols of everything the movement vowed to dismantle, their names spoken only as curses or warnings. In meeting rooms across the nation, her proposals were debated not with the empty condescension they might once have faced, but with genuine urgency and fear of irrelevance. Legislators scrambled to draft bills echoing her reforms, mayors called emergency sessions, and police chiefs, who had scoffed at her resolve, now found themselves forced to either adapt or resign. What began as a local fight had metastasized into a national reckoning, each new policy suggestion a sword plunged deeper into the heart of institutional decay. Amid all this, she remained unwavering. Her days were filled with strategy meetings, interviews, and speeches that never repeated themselves, yet always circled back to the same core principle. True justice could not be selective, could not be symbolic, and could not be delayed. Her supporters, once fragmented factions of activists, veterans, and everyday citizens, now moved as one relentless tide. In every march, every sit-in, every late-night policy drafting session, her influence was there, a silent general guiding an army no wall could contain. When the summit concluded, she stood on the steps outside, cameras flashing like summer lightning, microphones thrust toward her like arrows. She paused, her breath steady, her gaze sweeping the gathered crowd and beyond into the waiting future. "We do not reform to survive," she declared, her voice slicing cleanly through the noise. "We reform to finally live. We will not accept survival as victory. Our victory is measured only by the justice we leave behind for the next generation." The roar that followed could have toppled mountains, and for the first time in decades, those mountains trembled. The echo of her final declaration outside the national summit had barely begun to settle when a primetime television studio became the next stage for her battle. Under the blinding, white-hot studio lights, her figure seemed almost carved from stone, her uniform crisp, her posture unyielding. She sat opposite a renowned interviewer known for extracting confessions, her steely gaze unwavering even as the host attempted to pierce her armor with pointed questions. Millions tuned in live, their breaths caught in their throats as they watched her, a living testament to resilience. When she finally spoke, it was with a calmness that felt more explosive than any shout. Her voice, rich and controlled, rolled across the studio floor and reached into living rooms like a tide, pulling listeners into the depths of her truth. "This journey was never about revenge," she began, each word deliberate, echoing with the weight of 1,000 silent screams. "It's about demanding the dignity that has been denied to too many for too long. It's about the freedom to walk down a street without fear, to wear a uniform without a target painted on your back, to exist without apology." The interviewer, usually quick to interrupt, sat stunned, reduced to a vessel for her narrative. She recounted the gas station, the insults that clawed at her spirit, the threats that hung like a noose around her resolve. Her words painted a landscape of violence so vividly that viewers could almost smell the asphalt, feel the searing gaze of the officers, taste the copper tang of defiance rising in her throat. She did not flinch from the darkness. Instead, she illuminated it, forcing the world to look, to feel, to reckon. As her story unfurled, the cameras cut occasionally to images of Officer 1 and Officer 2, their faces twisted in bitter, pathetic attempts to salvage dignity in their own interviews. Their words rang hollow, sharp-edged apologies that clattered to the ground without resonance. Each smirk, each half-hearted shrug became a grotesque performance of cowardice next to her unbreakable composure. On social media, their names trended not as subjects of pity, but as cautionary symbols of corruption left to fester unchecked. She leaned forward, her gaze slicing into the lens with surgical precision. "Reform is not a line item on a budget sheet," she declared, her voice a blade. It is a transformation of spirit, a recognition that the badge you wear should protect, not persecute. If your power comes from fear, then you have no power at all, only borrowed terror waiting to be reclaimed. The studio fell into a silence so absolute that even the hum of the lights seemed to bow in reverence. As her words rippled outward, a fresh wave of reforms surged forward. Top-level officials who had watched from the sidelines now rushed to align themselves with her message, desperate to avoid the scalding judgment of a newly awakened public. Policy drafts flooded legislative inboxes, each one echoing the non-negotiable demands she had laid bare. Human rights organizations, emboldened by her audacity, launched parallel campaigns, creating an ecosystem of accountability that spread like wildfire across city councils and national committees. In living rooms across the country, viewers wept openly, their tears not of sorrow but of recognition, an unburdening of truths they had carried alone for too long. Veterans saluted her image on screen, children scrawled her name into the margins of their notebooks, and survivors of similar abuses whispered her words into their own darkness, finding them a torch to light their paths forward. Her story transcended the confines of the interview, metamorphosing into a shared narrative that threaded through communities like an electric current. Officer and Officer 2, meanwhile, found their final attempts at rehabilitation annihilated under the harsh floodlights of public scrutiny. Their defenses crumbled in real time, their once menacing authority reduced to meme fodder and cautionary news segments. They became walking specters of a decaying system, haunting no one but themselves, trapped in a loop of scorn and self-inflicted exile. As the interview drew to a close, the camera zoomed in on her face one last time, capturing not just the sharp line of her jaw or the steady flame in her eyes, but the invisible armor of a woman who had transformed herself into an unassailable fortress. "We are not here to ask for justice," she said, her final words echoing through every heart tuned in. "We are here to claim it, and we will not be silent again." When the broadcast ended, a collective exhale washed over the nation, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. But even as the credits rolled and screens faded to black, her voice lingered, an unyielding echo in the marrow of a society finally ready to confront its own reflection and demand something better. Her voice still echoed in millions of minds when the final verdict arrived like a lightning strike against an iron sky. In a courtroom packed to the rafters, the judge's gavel fell with a thunderous finality, each strike reverberating as a death knell to the illusion of untouchable authority. Officer 1 and Officer 2 stood motionless, their faces pale masks stretched over the hollow void of their arrogance. The words, "guilty of racial discrimination," cut through the air sharper than any blade, the syllables slicing away their last fragile shields. Sentences heavy enough to break the strongest wills were pronounced, ensuring they would never again wield power or hide behind the false safety of a badge. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a silent electric exhale, a moment where 1,000 hearts seemed to sync with hers. She sat, posture unbowed, eyes fixed forward, every muscle an iron cord of relief and resolve. When the judge's words finally settled into the marrow of the room, the collective hush broke into applause, not wild or frenzied, but measured, resolute, an acknowledgement that justice had finally arrived after a long, brutal march. Later that day, under the glint of television lights and in front of a crowd swelling with anticipation, she received an official apology from the police department. The statement, carefully worded and yet undeniably raw, acknowledged not just their failure to protect her, but their complicity in enabling the violence she endured. As the police commissioner read the words aloud, his voice quivered under the weight of truth long denied. When she stepped forward to accept the apology, she did not smile. Instead, she offered a nod, sharp enough to sever any illusions of easy redemption. In that moment, her expression carried the quiet weight of every soul who had been silenced before her. She did not need flowery words or tears to mark the gravity of this victory. Her stillness alone radiated a power that dwarfed the grandest speeches. It was the living embodiment of triumph hard won and never to be forgotten. Government officials scrambled to broadcast their support, their statements polished but tinged with urgency. New policy commitments poured forth like floodwaters finally breaching an ancient dam, pledges for body camera mandates, strengthened independent oversight, and a sweeping revamp of police training programs. Each sentence felt like a stone laid in the foundation of a new, more just era, though she knew these were only the beginning. Invitations to join social reform councils and human rights panels arrived in a deluge. She accepted them not as accolades but as battlefield, each meeting room a new front where the war for justice would continue. With each handshake, she carried not just her own scars, but the hopes of an entire generation now emboldened to believe in change. Her presence in those chambers was not ceremonial, it was transformative, a daily reminder that the world would not return to sleep. Meanwhile, Officer 1 and Officer 2 confronted the final, inescapable abyss of their choices. Stripped of badges and titles, they now faced the concrete consequences of their crimes: long sentences, personal ruin, and the crushing isolation of a society that had moved beyond them. Their attempts to appeal only deepened their disgrace, their pleas for leniency mocked by a public no longer interested in their narratives of victimhood. They were no longer men, but relics, echoing reminders of a chapter forcibly closed by the hands of justice itself. As she stepped out of the courthouse into the golden hue of a sinking sun, cameras swarmed, microphones launched forward, yet her gaze remained fixed on something beyond the horizon. Reporters clamored for quotes, but her voice rose above the din with a serene clarity that silenced them all. "Justice is not the end," she declared, her words falling into the hushed city like seeds on fertile ground. "It is the foundation. Our work begins here, and it will not stop until every voice is heard, every life protected, and every badge held accountable." The crowd erupted, this time not in relief, but in a shared, fiery vow to continue the march she had ignited. Her victory in court was more than a personal triumph, it was a collective awakening, a testament that when a single voice refuses to be drowned, it can become the roar that shakes even the oldest, most unyielding walls. Her words from the courthouse steps still pulsed through the veins of the city when the first waves of real, tangible change began to ripple across precincts. The reforms she had demanded so fiercely were no longer theoretical points on a whiteboard. They materialized into concrete action. Officers were retrained under new directives, emphasizing empathy, accountability, and unbiased service. Anti-racism workshops replaced hollow seminars, and independent civilian oversight boards gained unprecedented authority to investigate misconduct. The old guard, once shielded by unspoken codes and institutional cowardice, now found themselves shackled by rules designed to protect not them, but the people they had sworn to serve. Cities across the country adopted sweeping measures to dismantle systemic injustices woven into their policing structures. Body camera footage was released directly to public review panels, and whistleblower protections were expanded so that no voice could be silenced again by fear or retaliation. For the first time, communities that had lived for generations under the specter of suspicion and violence felt the tremors of hope radiating from her victory. Human rights organizations and political leaders, emboldened by her example, stepped forward into the spotlight. Speeches, once perfunctory and saturated with empty platitudes, now bristled with sincerity, urgency, and a fierce collective commitment to a more equitable society. Promises transformed into policies, and policies blossomed into action. The movement was no longer a spark, it was a wildfire, consuming outdated ideologies and forcing even the most reluctant bystanders to choose a side. Meanwhile, she rose into an icon beyond her own imagining. Invitations to speak at global human rights conferences flooded in. Panels debated her strategies as case studies of modern resistance and transformation. Her face adorned murals, classroom posters, and protest banners, not as a relic of a single victory, but as a living symbol of continuous defiance. Talk show hosts clamored for interviews, children dressed as her for school presentations, and survivors of injustice clung to her words as lifelines in their own struggles. Officer and Officer 2, once so smug and untouchable, now found their names synonymous with betrayal. Shunned from public spaces, spat upon in the rare moments they dared to appear, they rotted in a prison of their own making. Their crimes were dissected in documentaries and academic analyses, each frame capturing the precise moment their false power crumbled. They had become the ultimate cautionary tale, their downfall so thorough it seemed to echo in every footstep on city streets. At community forums and televised panels, her name became shorthand for courage uncompromised. Veteran activists, once hardened and skeptical, now quoted her speeches as foundational doctrine. Young organizers recited her words before marches, treating them as sacred vows rather than mere slogans. Entire generations looked to her as proof that justice wasn't just an ethereal dream but a tangible outcome wrested from the jaws of cruelty and indifference. The pinnacle of this new era arrived with the announcement of a historic national conference on social reform. Representatives from every major city, legal scholars, international observers, and community organizers converged under one roof, united not by shared ideology, but by an unshakable determination to build a society in which dignity was not selective but universal. And at the helm of this monumental gathering stood she, commanding, unwavering, an unassailable force guiding them all toward a future reimagined. As she took the podium, the hall fell into a reverent silence, the kind usually reserved for final prayers or first breaths. Her eyes swept the audience. Seasoned legislators, fierce youth leaders, worn mothers carrying photos of lost sons, dreamers clutching journals heavy with plans. When she spoke, her voice was a living testament to every wound endured, every small victory stitched into a broader tapestry of revolution. Justice is not a destination, she declared, her tone both gentle and immovable, but a daily practice, a collective heartbeat, a promise we must renew with every sunrise. The hall erupted not with polite applause, but with a roar that vibrated through marble walls and splintered ceiling, a sound so primal it felt as though the earth itself might shift in response. In that moment, every chain of apathy and fear seemed to snap, every false narrative turned to dust. From that day forward, she wasn't just a soldier or a victim who fought back. She was a lighthouse, cutting through generations of fog, a living testament to the unyielding power of a single voice fortified by millions more. As her silhouette receded into the glow of countless camera flashes, Officer Darnell stumbled from a side corridor, hoping to slip into the night unseen, but a group of nurses blocked his path, their scrubs splattered with paint from a mural they had just finished in her honor. One nurse stepped forward, her gloved hands raised like shields, and spat at his feet, a gesture more cutting than any spoken condemnation. The live stream of the confrontation garnered millions of views within minutes, the comments flooding with calls for further accountability. Meanwhile, Officer Hughes attempted to enter a late-night pharmacy, his baseball cap pulled low, but the pharmacist, a young man with a scar arching across his cheek like a silent scream, refused to ring up his items. Instead, he picked up a microphone usually reserved for price checks and announced to the entire store, "We do not serve architects of pain here." Customers burst into spontaneous applause, capturing the moment from every angle, turning his exit into a viral exorcism of collective rage. At the edge of the city park, a towering projection illuminated a grove of oaks, Officer Darnell's face flickering in grotesque loops, each glitch and pixel fracture mirroring the fractures he had carved into so many lives. Strangers left notes at the roots of those trees, messages woven from pain and forgiveness denied, each paper scrap another stitch in the city's slowly healing wound. Further downtown, a teenage violinist stood atop a fountain, playing a haunting melody as passers-by chanted her name between refrains, their voices rising and falling like a single, unstoppable tide. In a nearby cafe, Officer Hughes tried to order a black coffee, his hands trembling as if each finger held a separate confession, but the barista looked him dead in the eyes and calmly poured the hot brew down the sink, steam curling up like a spectral rebuke. By then, his presence had already drawn a small crowd, their phones raised, faces lit not by curiosity, but by a fierce, unblinking solidarity. Above them, digital billboards flashed her words on loop, each letter burning against the night sky, a new constellation charting the coordinates of collective awakening. She walked among them afterward, not in grand strides, but in small, deliberate steps, pausing to press her palm against murals, to trace the lines of protest poems scrawled onto cracked sidewalks, her breath mingling with chants that no longer belonged to any one person but to an entire reborn city. Her eyes, reflecting 1,000 points of light, saw every tremor of transformation. The young mother breastfeeding on courthouse steps beneath a banner that read, "Justice begins at home." The old man who once feared the riot shields, now teaching children how to hold protest signs steady against the wind. Lanterns floated above rooftops like luminous prayers, drifting beyond the skyline, each one carrying a vow that the past would never again become prologue. In those lantern-lit streets, no echo went unanswered, no tear fell unseen. Even in the hushed corridors of legislative chambers, her name reverberated against mahogany desks and polished floors, a spectral presence challenging every whispered deal and every silent complicity. Each policy draft, each vote cast beneath those high arches carried a hidden pulse, the steady thrum of her conviction, anchoring lawmakers who once bent in the breeze of convenience. The ink on new charters shimmered as though alive, binding not just words to paper but entire generations to an oath of vigilance. And in every step forward, every policy passed, every voice finally heard, her spirit marched alongside them, an eternal guardian of the truth she had so fiercely defended. As dawn painted the city skyline in a cascade of molten gold, she stepped onto a stage built not of wood and steel, but of years of struggle, sacrifice, and unyielding defiance. The crowd stretched endlessly, a sea of faces lit by the soft glow of candles and the fiercer blaze of unwavering hope. Flags bearing her likeness waved above heads bowed in reverence, and chants of her name rolled through the air like a living heartbeat. Cameras from every network perched like hawks, eager to capture a moment that had already transcended history. She stood tall, her uniform crisp, the insignia gleaming under spotlights that seemed too dim to capture the true radiance of her presence. Her gaze swept over the assembly, not as a figurehead, but as a sentinel who had weathered every storm to stand guard over a newly awakened conscience. When she spoke, her voice did not thunder. It resonated, each word a chisel against the bedrock of complacency. Far across the city, in a cracked motel room, Officer 1 huddled beneath a flickering television screen, his face gaunt, eyes wide and wet with a terror he once wielded against others. Outside his door, someone had carved the word "traitor" deep into the paint, a final brand upon the ruins of his arrogance. In another corner of town, Officer 2 wandered through a grocery store, each aisle a gauntlet of turned backs and whispered curses, his cart abandoned halfway as a teenager hurled a rotten tomato that burst against his chest like a bloodstain of shame, a chorus of laughter rising and chasing him out into the raw night. In a dim cafe where he sought a moment of anonymity, an elderly woman rose without a word, smashed her coffee cup against the floor and pointed at him, her silence louder than any accusation, the shards glinting like tiny verdicts beneath his trembling feet. Meanwhile, a viral video spiraled across every platform. Officer Peyote 1 trying to apologize in a crowded park, only to be pelted with empty water bottles, the sound of plastic striking flesh punctuated by jeers that followed him down the street, his once commanding stride reduced to a pathetic scurry, a living monument to disgrace. Back on the stage, she inhaled the hush that wrapped around her like a cloak, her breath steady, her eyes catching every flicker of candlelight, every tear sliding down a stranger's cheek, each one an echo of 1,000 buried laments now set free. Her hand rose slowly, a gesture that seemed to summon the collective pulse of the nation, and when she finally spoke again, it felt as if the very ground leaned in to listen. "This journey was never about me alone," she began, her eyes burning with an intensity that fused vulnerability and unbreakable steel. It was about every life silenced before its story could be told, every dream suffocated under the boot of bigotry, every heartbeat denied its full measure. The crowd was silent, hanging on to each syllable as if the very air depended on her cadence. She continued, weaving her own scars into a tapestry of collective endurance and triumph. "I did not fight to be remembered," she declared, her hands gesturing like a general marshaling unseen legions. "I fought so that no one else would have to stand alone in the shadows, so that every child born into this world could believe, truly believe, that their worth is inherent and untouchable." The glow of the stage lights carved sharp silhouettes across her face, illuminating the rivers of grief and defiance that had etched themselves into the soft lines near her mouth. Outside, a restless tide of onlookers pressed against the barriers, their faces luminous with a hunger for justice that had been denied too long. In a nearby alley, a viral moment unfolded as Officer 1, stripped of his uniform and cloaked only in the threadbare remains of his arrogance, attempted to enter a shelter for veterans. A volunteer recognized his face and, without a word, pulled the door shut so firmly that the echo reverberated down the block like a slammed gavel. Meanwhile, in the dimness of a coffee shop across town, Officer 2 was cornered by a group of high school students who had seen the leaked footage of his brutality on loop for weeks. They surrounded him not with fists but with a wall of righteous mockery, chanting the names of those he had wronged, their voices weaving a spell too potent for him to escape. The barista refused to serve him, sliding the cup he ordered into the trash with a cold precision that drew cheers from the small crowd gathering outside. News helicopters hovered above like mechanical vultures, capturing every stuttering attempt he made to justify his past actions. At a hastily arranged press conference in a crumbling municipal hall, Officer 1 tried to read a statement, but each line was drowned out by a chorus of booing so visceral that the microphones crackled under the pressure of collective fury. Reporters turned their backs on him, their cameras trained instead on the tear-streaked faces of those who had come to reclaim pieces of their dignity from the ashes of his cruelty. A mother held up a placard showing her son's bloodied shirt, her silent presence more deafening than any shouted curse. Down at the edge of the city's industrial district, a warehouse mural sprang up overnight, painted by anonymous hands that captured Officer 2's distorted visage beneath the words, "The Unforgiven," a symbol too potent for even the most indifferent passers-by to ignore. Each spray of paint was a vow, each stroke an indictment, binding the community in an unspoken pact that no hatred would ever again be allowed to fester unchallenged. In every grocery aisle, whispers followed them like phantom limbs, shoppers turning abruptly away, leaving behind only the sterile scent of disinfectant and the brittle crackle of abandoned plastic bags. Former allies ghosted their calls, afraid to be contaminated by association, their names deleted from phone lists as swiftly as a virus scrubbed from a hard drive. It was in these small, countless humiliations that the architecture of their downfall was meticulously laid, brick by brick, a cathedral of retribution rising in silence and moonlight. They found no refuge in their own homes, where eviction notices slid under the door like pale fingers tapping out a final verdict. At night, the wind carried scraps of protest songs through cracked windows, each note a scalpel cutting through their self-spun myths of invincibility, their dreams fractured into shards, reflecting not the glory they once imagined, but the hollow emptiness of power misused and irrevocably lost. In the labyrinth of their regrets, the walls closed tighter with every gasp of the public's derision, until even the most mundane acts, buying bread, crossing a street, meeting an old friend, became arenas of judgment and performance. Every street corner they turned was a tribunal, every eye contact a cross-examination, every unspoken word a verdict. In this relentless cycle of exposure and repudiation, they discovered too late that there is no sanctuary for those who make themselves the architects of other people's suffering. As the sad tale of the San Francisco-Philadelphia incident has the currency of their past choices returned to them not as gold or honor, but as an unpayable debt, written in the language of empty rooms and scorched bridges. And so Officer 1 and Officer 2 drifted through the hours and days like shadows bleeding into concrete, unable to anchor themselves to anything but their own echoes. In the end, they found themselves beyond forgiveness, beyond redemption, the final chapters of their stories scrawled in the public's collective conscience with a clarity that no revision could obscure. They roamed the edges of society as ghosts, reminders that actions rooted in hatred will always come home to roost. In her address, she refused to mention them by name, denying them the power they once believed immutable. Instead, she focused on the living, the yet-to-be-born, the countless voices that now rose with her. This fight, she said, her voice growing in quiet ferocity, was not just for justice as a concept, but for justice as a living, breathing reality, a reality that demands vigilance, demands courage, and above all, demands that we never, ever surrender to the easy comfort of silence. The words ignited a fire in the crowd, a palpable shift as people stood taller, clutched each other's hands tighter, and felt the tectonic movement of collective purpose. She spoke of the long nights, the solitary battles fought in unseen rooms, the toll exacted on her spirit and body alike. Far beyond the bright stage lights, Officer Leland staggered through the back alley of a supermarket, his face hidden beneath a frayed hoodie, only to be met by a group of mothers who recognized him from the viral footage of his violent outburst against an unarmed teenager. Without a word, they formed a wall with their strollers, their silent defiance more suffocating than any shouted insult, forcing him to retreat into the shadows like a hunted beast. Meanwhile, Officer Kane attempted to enter a public library to escape the jeering masses outside, but the librarian, an elderly woman with tremors in her fingers, refused him entry, her gaze as sharp as broken glass, her voice trembling but unwavering as she declared, "Your presence defiles these walls." On the same afternoon, a viral live stream showed a cafe owner pouring Officer Leland's coffee onto the pavement in front of a gathering crowd, each drop sizzling on the hot concrete like small, precise incisions into his already festering reputation. The onlookers erupted into a chant, their rhythm echoing against the storefronts, each syllable a hammer blow against his claim to any semblance of dignity. Further downtown, a mural appeared overnight on the side of an abandoned theater, depicting Officer Kane in grotesque distortion, his hands cracked and dripping ink that formed the names of those he had silenced. Strangers gathered in reverence and rage, some leaving candles, others tracing the outlines with trembling fingers, as if summoning an unspoken pact to remember forever. She described these moments without bitterness, her voice steady as the moon over a restless ocean, each syllable a vessel carrying fragments of pain and courage across the chasms of disbelief. She told them about the letters she received, written in shaking handwriting, from elders who had survived darker decades, and from children who learned to whisper her name as a promise to themselves. Each letter, she said, was a quiet explosion in her chest, a reminder that her defiance had ignited small bonfires in places she would never see. She spoke of the bruises that never fully faded, the nights when her breathing felt like shards of glass scraping her lungs, and the mornings when the sun felt too heavy to rise against. Yet she rose, again and again, her presence a relentless tide wearing down even the tallest cliffs of cruelty. The crowd inhaled as one organism, a collective lung expanding with the promise of something greater than each individual struggle. She conjured images of rooms where she had been spat upon, courtrooms where her words were twisted into cages, and corridors where officials snickered behind closed doors. Yet amid these echoing humiliations, she insisted the most powerful weapon remained her voice, undiluted and defiant, a single note slicing through the dense smog of lies. She recalled seeing Officer Leland's trembling hands on a television screen, fingers once curled into fists of authority, now reduced to shaking apologies that no one accepted. She recounted Officer Kane's face as he stood before a grocery store entrance, a sign in the window reading, "No entry for cowards," the glass reflecting his own hollowness back at him. Each anecdote fell into the crowd like a stone into water, sending ripples through every hidden shame and latent fury. She paused, letting the gravity of her words nestle into the marrow of each listener. the silence vibrating like the taut string of a violin before the first note. In that hush, she carried the weight of generations who had been told to bow their heads, to speak only when spoken to vanish from history like forgotten shadows. She refused to be the final echo of that lineage. Her fingers curled around the edges of the podium as if grasping the pulse of the earth itself, her eyes shimmering beneath the hot glare, reflecting not only her own battles, but the untold wars raging within each heart present. And as her voice lifted once more, the atmosphere shivered with an electric intimacy, a collective heartbeat thudding in the chests of strangers who would never again look at silence as safety. But in each memory lay the seed of an invincible truth, that a single unwavering voice, armed with conviction, could fracture even the oldest, hardest stones of oppression. Somewhere beyond the floodlights, Officer 1 and Officer 2 watched in bitter isolation, their faces pale tapestries of regret and resentment. They finally understood that redemption was not an entitlement but a grace earned through truth and remorse, virtues they had never possessed. Their exile was not just physical, but spiritual, an endless spiral into the void of their own making. Back on stage, she took a moment to close her eyes, inhaling the sea of charged breaths around her. When she opened them, her gaze shimmered with tears that refused to fall, her jaw set in a final declaration. Her voice rose above the restless murmur like a blade carving through fog, slicing away decades of sanctioned cruelty. In a nearby square, a live stream captured Officer 1 attempting to buy bread at a small corner bakery, only to be met by the baker's back turned rigidly toward him, the air thick with the smell of burnt loaves, left unattended as a silent act of protest. The camera zoomed in on the sign hastily taped to the counter, "No service for betrayers of humanity," each word handwritten, each stroke a wound that would not close. At the same time, across the city, Officer D2 tried to slip into a community center where he once gave lectures on civic duty. But the security guard, a young woman with braids cascading down her shoulders like rivers of midnight, held up a single palm, her stare unwavering. And in that motion, centuries of silenced voices seemed to surge forward. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her refusal roared louder than 1,000 courtroom verdicts. Meanwhile, an artist painted a colossal mural overnight on the side of the old courthouse, depicting Officer 1 and Officer 2 kneeling beneath a gavel, morphing into a tree, its roots spiraling into the names of victims they had tried to erase. By sunrise, hundreds gathered, some leaving candles shaped like small fists, others holding mirrors to the mural as if demanding the officers confront the distortions of their own reflections. The footage of their humiliation looped endlessly across every screen, seeping into households like a bitter wind, each replay another nail driven into the coffin of their once untouchable authority. Above the noise, her words carried, undeterred, steady as a drumbeat echoing through the marrow of every listener. She spoke of darkened hallways where her footsteps once trembled against the marble floors, of courtrooms that smelled of stale sweat and old paper, where her testimony was dissected like a foreign language no one wished to understand. She remembered each slammed door, each whispered threat pressed against her eardrums like cold steel, and each sleepless night where the moon bore witness to her silent tears. Yet she stood before them now, an unbowed silhouette burning against the light, her pulse synchronizing with the collective heartbeats of those gathered below. Her fingers curled over the microphone as though cradling a fragile promise too precious to let slip, her breath slow and deliberate, each exhale an uncoiling of pain into resolve. Far below, a group of teenagers projected Officer 2's leaked apology onto a brick wall, rewriting it line by line into a poem of mockery, each stanza dripping with the venom of disappointed hopes, turned righteous fury. Passers-by recorded the performance, flooding the airwaves with snippets of laughter and tears entwined like two inseparable strands of history. The city's arteries pulsed with this defiance. Neon signs flickering into new slogans overnight, crosswalks repainted with declarations of unwavering dignity. She drew in another breath, her spine a column of living steel, her eyes shimmering beneath the harsh stage lights, reflecting not just her singular pain, but the ocean of silent screams finally given voice through her. Her lips parted, releasing syllables that crawled into the crevices of every fractured spirit present, stitching them together with a thread of collective rebirth. In that trembling pause before her final vow, time seemed to lurch and hold its breath, as if the universe itself leaned forward to catch the sound of her truth. Her words seared across the horizon like dawn breaking after endless nights, igniting dormant fires in chests long resigned to smolder in pride. And I will keep fighting until justice is no longer a hope but a birthright. Thunderous applause crashed like waves against cliffs, the sound carrying far beyond city limits, beyond screens, beyond borders. It was a collective roar, not just of celebration, but of a solemn oath renewed in every heart. As she stepped back from the podium, the night air embraced her like an old friend, the echoes of her words now immortal in the marrow of a changed world. In a cramped alley behind the city hall, Officer Granger tried to slip unnoticed into a convenience store, his once crisp uniform now traded for a stained hoodie and trembling hands. But the cashier, a wiry young man with defiant eyes, simply pointed to a sign taped above the counter, "No entry for oppressors." Cameras captured the moment he turned away, his shoulders collapsing inward, and within minutes the footage flooded every platform, millions watching as his downfall solidified into an unerasable scar. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Salter approached a public bus stop, hoping to disappear among the late-night crowd, but a grandmother selling roses recognized his face and hurled a single bloom at his feet, her voice cracking as she shouted, "Your badge was a mask for your cowardice." The petals scattered beneath him like splintered dreams, and commuters quickly encircled him, chanting, their voices weaving into a tapestry of defiance that no bus could carry him away from. Further uptown, a silent march flowed past a high-rise, where Officer Granger once held lectures on order and respect, participants carrying lanterns shaped like open eyes, each flicker illuminating the hypocrisy he had embodied for years. Projected onto the building's sleek facade was a looping clip of his last public speech, distorted and warped into a grotesque echo chamber of his own arrogance, each stumble magnified into a hymn of his unraveling. In the city square, a street artist painted Officer Salter's face, melting into a pool of ink, tendrils spelling the names of every victim whose pleas he had ignored. Strangers lined up to add their fingerprints in red paint, a living testament to wounds once invisible, now roaring into permanence under the moon's watchful eye. Through these countless small rebellions, the city's veins pulsed with a new resolve, each heartbeat another nail in the coffin of complacency. She walked among them after her speech. Unnoticed at first, her shadow brushing against sidewalks where chants rose like volcanic tremors beneath old asphalt. Her presence, though quiet, felt like lightning caught in human form, illuminating corners where silence once reigned supreme. The wind carried pieces of torn posters, each fragment a reminder of the old regime's false promises, now littering doorsteps as relics of a past too corroded to reclaim. She glanced upward, eyes reflecting neon signs recast into slogans of collective rebirth, their electric glow crawling over glass and steel like ivy reclaiming a forgotten ruin. At every turn, she felt the city breathing with her, an organism newly awakened, its spine straightened by the weight of countless whispered prayers finally spoken aloud. Passing an underpass, she saw a teenage girl leading a group in rewriting hateful graffiti into poems of resistance, each verse stitched into the concrete like a new layer of skin over an old scar. As she moved forward, her fingers brushed over chipped walls, her pulse harmonizing with the drum beats echoing from distant alleys, the rhythm a shared promise that none would be left behind again. The echoes of her vow twisted around lampposts and wrapped around benches where strangers clasped hands beneath the flickering glow, their eyes shimmering with a hunger that could no longer be caged by laws or badges. In each step she carried the weight of every silent song, every stifled cry, every dream strangled before birth, and with each exhale, she offered them back as seeds, scattering them into the dark corners of a future yet unwritten. She knew that tonight was not a conclusion but a genesis, an ignition point that would set entire generations ablaze with a hunger for truths too long buried beneath cracked court seals and polished speeches. Her breath mingled with the city's, a shared lung expanding beyond what any solitary heart could hold. And as she reached the edge of the square, she paused, the final chords of chants fading into a tender hush that vibrated under her skin like the memory of a heartbeat in a quiet room. The final scene closed not with an ending, but with an invitation, an eternal flame urging each witness to pick up the torch, to march forward into the vast unknown, hearts alight with an unbreakable belief in a justice truly realized.